Hi guys! So welcome to the virtual lecture on virtual pilgrimage. Just want to reiterate a few quick things before we get started. First, yes, again, I will be providing the PowerPoint to Sarah for study purposes, so don't worry too much about writing single thing down that's on the slide. Again, you will have it probably within 24 or 48 hours of this recording going live, so don't worry about that. Also, just to let you know, since my thesis was on this, I'll be referencing that several times. If ever you want to look it up, this is actually the title here, The Pilgrim Called Vivant, Closing the Gap Between Foundational Typologies and Non-Locative Pilgrimage Practices. At the time of this recording, it's not yet available in the library, however, I do believe it will be quite shortly. So without further ado, let's get started. Pilgrimage is a universal phenomenon. Through this quote, Deborah Ross alludes to the fact that sacred journeying is part of virtually all major religious traditions. In 2018, an estimated 2.37 million Muslims from around the world performed the annual Hajj pilgrimage to the city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. In 2016, over 75 million pilgrims traveled to bathe in the Kashmira River and India as part of the Kumbh Mela, which occurs every 3 years. Every year, an estimated 6 million Christians pilgrims visit Lourdes, France, to bathe in the waters for their healing properties. As pilgrimage practice appears in many world religions, it necessarily still impacts the lives of millions of people today. Similarly, it may come as no surprise that pilgrimage is typically understood by the general public as grounded within physical mobility. As noted by Connie Hill Smith in Cyber Pilgrimage, a study of authenticity, presence, and meaning in online pilgrim experiences, modern forms of non-locative pilgrimage, such as cyber pilgrimage, which utilizes the internet as primary vehicle to visit sacred locations, are often regarded with suspicion as to their legitimacy of experience. Quote, "The reluctance to accept cyber pilgrimage suggests a view that experience should be physically grounded to be considered authentic, and therefore ratifiable and deserving of similar benefit to traditional physical pilgrimage." End quote. According to this understanding, the legitimacy of pilgrimage is somehow connected to the physical body of the pilgrim traveling to a geographically sacred space. Viewing pilgrimage in such a way ignores the multitude of historical non-locative practices understood as pilgrimage within the Catholic Christian tradition. Surprisingly, non-locative forms of pilgrimage are typically not discussed in pilgrimage studies itself. For example, in the introduction to Contesting the Sacred, John Eade and Michael Salno, who you've already met, discuss the various activities surrounding the Lourdes Shrine in France. In their discussion of the healing shrine, there is no mention of those who cannot leave their everyday lives to travel to Lourdes, nor the measures that are undertaken to transport the healing powers of the shrine back to these individuals. As noted by Leanne Craig in Wandering Women and Holy Matrons, Women as Pilgrims in the Latter Middle Ages, the practice of object-making pilgrimage fills this negative space. From late antiquity onwards, pilgrims have created third-class relics through placing objects into contact with holy items or places in order to return home with some healing properties. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the relic trade was quite lucrative for this reason. Quote, "Would-be pilgrims could thus expect to accrue some of the benefit of a bodily visit to a shrine through their interactions with objects, which had either been sent to a shrine with another pilgrim or purchased at the shrine itself." End quote. In my thesis, I addressed the lacuna present in two foundational modern pilgrimage typologies, and proposed a point of clarification that will allow the discussion of both locative, or physical, and non-locative journeys. I developed this through 3 steps. First, I selected Dicyon Pilger by Friar Felix Fabry as an example of non-locative pilgrimage, which has historically been understood to be comparable to, if not more beneficial than, locative pilgrimage. Second, I examined the foundational pilgrimage typologies of Victor and Edith Turner and John Eade and Michael Salno, and proposed a clarification as to the role of the pilgrim through the phenomenological research of Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Third, I placed Dicyon Pilger into conversation with the Turners and Eade and Salno's typology, as clarified through Merleau-Ponty. Through proceeding in such a way, it was my goal to see if it's possible to use such typologies to discuss instances of non-locative pilgrimage. Now, if none of this makes sense, don't worry, it will very shortly, I promise. In order to verify the suitability of modern typologies, some of which you've already seen, to speak of non-locative journeys, one specific journey had to be selected. The one I chose was the 15th century text Dicyon Pilger by Dominican friar and pilgrim Felix Fabry. Not only does it recreate the pilgrimage experience for those unable to travel or leave their everyday lives, but it's one of the most detailed, authoritative examples of this type of pilgrimage guidebook. The text was written in 1492 at the behest of the observant Reformed women's houses of Mettingen and Medlingen in the province of Ulm in what is modern-day Germany. These houses were cloistered, meaning that the nuns were not able to leave their physical location on pilgrimage due to their vow of stability of place, or stabilis loci. The sisters wished to have detailed first-hand account, which listed how to obtain and what amount of indulgences they would get, of the three major Christian pilgrimage routes of that time. So the pilgrimage to Rome, St. James Way, and the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. They wished to experience the journey themselves and gain all indulgences associated with the pilgrimage. An indulgence is a partial remission of the amount of time spent after death in purgatory, undergoing the process of purgation or purification, before and being allowed to enter into heaven. The more indulgences one accrues in their earthly lives, the less time spent in purgatory, which is what you want to avoid. Within the completed work, Fabry describes the three pilgrimage journeys, with one on each route, with his hometown of Ulm serving as both start point and end point for each, as well as providing detailed instructions for how a non-locative, narrative-driven pilgrimage should be undertaken. Those who engaged in this form of travel, termed scion pilgrims, would use these daily non-locative journeys to travel pilgrimage routes without leaving their quotidian everyday lives, while gaining the same and sometimes even greater indulgences than those who physically traveled to these sacred spaces, termed the nightly pilgrims. Within my own research, preference was given to the section of Dicyon Pilger which described the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. I did this because although Fabry wrote about both the trek to Rome and Santiago, Jerusalem was the only location out of the three which he personally visited as a pilgrim. Interestingly, he did go to Rome during his life, but this was purely on business. And as we all know, when you go to a town just for business, you kind of have a different experience. Dicyon Pilger engages non-locative pilgrimage in a way that is no less real than its physical counterpart, and takes measures to recreate the central experience as much as possible. Before engaging in this sacred journey, the would-be scion pilgrim must ask the permission of their spiritual superiors. This is exactly the same permission required by the nightly pilgrim prior to their departure. Like their physical counterparts, scion pilgrims are not to perform this pilgrimage alone, as to avoid the dangers of the road, but may do so only in special instances if their, quote, superiors or confessors ridicule the idea of spiritual pilgrimage, end quote. Once their journey had commenced, much like one could expect as a nightly pilgrim, the scion pilgrims would experience some days which were more difficult than others. This was experienced by the scion pilgrims in two ways. First, Dision Pilger leads the pilgrim through the readings and prayers which the nightly pilgrims would engage in on a daily basis. In addition to these, the Sion pilgrims were encouraged to read a psalm or two each day of the journey, beginning with the first. Second, the Sion pilgrim was led through directed imaginings each day of the voyage. These were not only spiritual exercises, but a way in which the Sion pilgrims may embody in some way the lived experience of the nightly pilgrims. For instance, quote, "On day 27, the Sion pilgrims suffer a strong wind that turns into a thunderstorm and blows the ship to and fro. The pilgrims have great angst, becoming dizzy, and even so ill that they retch. They fear for their lives. Therefore, says Fabry, the pilgrims have a woeful, difficult night upon the water, keeping vigil by whichever saint whose day it happens to be." End quote. It is not simply enough for the Sion pilgrim to read these words. Rather, they are actively encouraged to feel seasick themselves, thereby embodying the experience and gaining the same penitential benefits as the nightly pilgrim living this hardship physically. In order to better prepare themselves for the potential spike in activity from day to day, Sion pilgrims are advised to look ahead to the next day, as to psychologically prepare themselves for the type of day they will have, much like a physical pilgrim would examine a map to look at the terrain to be covered the next day. In writing this work, Fabry was not simply providing the Sion pilgrim with a second-rate pilgrimage experience, but rather with an even more beneficial one than the one experienced by the nightly pilgrims. This was especially true for women, as traveling in this way allowed them to enter locations that they would be barred from in real life, due to their gender. For example, Fabry takes his readers through the Church of St. John Lateran. They enter into, quote, "St. John's Chapel, into which no woman may enter. However, the Pope has given a dispensation for the Sion pilgrims," end quote. Engaging in pilgrimage in this way was not only beneficial for gaining access to locations that some pilgrims could not otherwise enter. Sion pilgrims were also able to view the Holy Lands in a more free and Christianized state than the nightly pilgrim. Quote, "The nightly pilgrim visits Jerusalem as in a heathen city, but the Christian possesses the sepulchre. And thus all the churches are open without hindrance of the heathen. The Sion pilgrim goes in the Holy Land where he will, without care, and remains as long as he likes." End quote. During this period, Jerusalem was in control of the Ottoman Empire, which was seen by Fabry as a dangerous and even polluting the sacred land itself. Thus, by engaging in interior pilgrimage, one could avoid all the spiritual restrictions that were in place by the Ottoman Empire, as well as what Fabry views as potential spiritual dangers as well of the region being inhabited by these people. Such non-locative travel was possible as the Sion pilgrims understood themselves as occupying two distinct locations at once. This is a phenomenon called co-location, where they were aware that their physical bodies were situated in their monasteries or homes, but were also experiencing themselves simultaneously as journeying in spirit with the nightly pilgrims in the Holy Lands. Through his use of narrative, Fabry allowed the cloistered monks and nuns to experience pilgrimage and accrue all associated indulgences without leaving their quotidian lives and potentially putting themselves in physical and spiritual danger. Turning to the pilgrimage typologies. In selecting specific typologies or understandings of pilgrimage, my goal was to choose those which served as the very foundation for current academic discourse. As you've seen throughout this course, modern pilgrimage studies really had its beginnings with the seminal work of husband and wife duo Victor Turner and Edith Turner in Image and Pilgrimage in Christian Culture, published in 1978. A second generation of pilgrimage scholars emerged in response to the Turner's theory, most notably catalyzed by anthropologists John Eade and Michael Salno in Contesting the Sacred, The Anthropology of Christian Pilgrimage, published originally in 1991. The Turners presented a typology of pilgrimage which reflects ethnographer Arnold van Gennep's works on the rite of passage among tribal societies. The Turners state that Christian pilgrimages, like rites of passage, take place in 3 parts. First, the pilgrim leaves their quotidian lives to journey towards a sacred space. These destinations, also referred to as sacred centers, are locations out there, or outside of the pilgrim's everyday reality. According to the Turners, these sites are typically associated with a sacred image of a divine figure or cultural story, apparitions of a divine figure, and or the birthplace, location of defining life events, or even the grave of a holy person. In choosing to leave the everyday, pilgrims enter a liminal space where they are neither at home nor arrived at their final destination. They are on the way. Second, the pilgrim journeys towards the sacred center. It is during this act of meaningful movement that the pilgrim purportedly experiences communitas, or fellow feeling, with other travelers. Quote, "As commonplace social distinctions disappear, and individuals relate to each other as equals," end quote. The lack of hierarchy during pilgrimage allows for meaningful communication between those who would not be able to communicate thusly in the everyday hierarchical community structure. It is experienced directly on the journey as a, quote, "strong and sudden feeling of being unique, yet equally part of the human race," end quote. As the pilgrims reach the sacred center, they are exposed to increased and intensified symbolism representative of the traditional social-religious structure. Their once free state increasingly becomes circumscribed by, quote, "symbolic structures such as religious buildings, pictorial images, statuary, and sacralized features of the topography," end quote. These sacred symbols become increasingly frequent as to prime the pilgrim for an encounter with the, quote, "culturally defined experiences of the founder, and of those depicted as standing in some close relationship with him or her," end quote. The Turners note that the accumulated fatigue generated from the long-distance travel away from their everyday lives leaves pilgrims in a state where they are vulnerable to such cultural symbolic encoding. Once pilgrims reach their destination, they often engage in ritualized encounter with the associated figure and may experience communitas with the divine figure themselves. Third, the pilgrims return to their quotidian lives ostensibly changed and in a modified position within the social hierarchy. The pilgrims' shift in communal status does not come from any form of increased economic prosperity, as quite the opposite tends to occur, but in spiritual capital. Within the Christian community, the returning traveler is regarded as having progressed spiritually through the experience of the pilgrimage's hardships and the direct encounter with the divine figure. In addition, pilgrims will often self-report personal growth as a result of the experience, either spiritually, emotionally, and/or psychologically. When taking on the Turners as co-locators, the work of Eden Salno must also be addressed because they are the seminal critics of the Turners' typology, creating a, quote, "significant impact on pilgrimage studies in the 1990s," end quote. They critique the Turners' view of communitas as being overly utopian in nature and not reflecting the reality of sacred centers. Eden Salno posit that the geographic location itself doesn't contain any inherent universal meaning. Rather, it acts as a religious void, in which figures of authority and pilgrims alike attribute their own meanings. For example, drawing on the work of Glenn Bowman, on a macroscopic level, the city of Jerusalem is home to the sacred centers for the traditions and faith systems of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. At the micro level, the meanings imbued to a specific location may differ based on denominations within a tradition, owing to their understanding of the sacred. Whereas for Greek Orthodox pilgrims, the geographic location may not be as important as the icons contained on the site, while for Roman Catholics the geographic location may be of primary importance, quote, in that it's illustrative of a particular biblical text reflecting the life of Jesus or of a particular saint, end quote. As such, sacred centers are locations where competing meanings associated with the space are brought together, both through pilgrims and religious authorities of differing backgrounds, as well as differing roles. Eden Salno proposed a new understanding of pilgrimage and the interplay among the people who visit sacred centers, the sites themselves, and the narratives associated with them, or, as you've seen, the triad of persons, places, and texts. In considering the suitability of pilgrimage typologies to discuss non-locative journeys, the lacuna of non-physicality must be addressed. Without clarifying the silence that occurs in both the Turners and Eden Salno, as neither of them deal directly with any form of non-locative travel, it's entirely possible to reduce pilgrimage down to a type of sacred journeying which only involves physical leave-taking. The clarification required, I found, was present in the form of the ontology of the human person, as described by Maurice Merleau-Ponty. In Phenomenology of Perception, Merleau-Ponty presents a phenomenological understanding of human beings as neither reductively material nor essentially intellectual or spiritual. Rather, he utilizes the term living body, or le corps vivant, to represent the holistic, experienced reality of being human. In using this term, Merleau-Ponty rejects that human experience is restricted to purely the mind, suggesting rather that it arises in the interaction of a human person as a mind-body unit within the world. Quote, "The world is not what I think, but what I live through," end quote. For Merleau-Ponty, the physical and intellectual or spiritual aspects of a person are not two distinct entities, but rather work together. Quote, "Humans taken as concrete being is not just a psyche joined to an organism, but the movement to and fro of existence, which at one time allows itself to take corporal form, and at others moves towards personal acts. Psychological motives and bodily occasions may overlap because there's not a single impulse in a living body which is entirely fortuitous in relation to psychic intentions, and not a single mental act which has not found at least a germ of its general outline in psychological tendencies." End quote. What can be said of pilgrims, then, is that they are made up of both the physical body and non-physical intellect or spirit. As suggested by Merleau-Ponty, there is no inherent privileging of one aspect over the other, as they both work together at all times. In this way, it is possible to talk of non-locative pilgrimage, as, although they begin with the spiritual instead of the physical, they equally engage the pilgrim as a holistic being similar to their locative counterparts. With the clarification of Merleau-Ponty, it becomes possible to use the typologies of both the Turners and Eden Salno to talk of non-locative pilgrimage. As discussed by anthropologist Simon Coleman in Do You Believe in Pilgrimage? Communitas, Contestation, and Beyond, quote, "Both communitas and contestation have proven exceptionally good tools for scholars to think with," end quote. In bringing these into conversation with Dicyon Pilger, I did not look for a perfect match with either understanding of pilgrimage. As Coleman notes later within the same article, neither of these typologies are exhaustive in nature, meaning that they don't say everything about pilgrimage. Although there may be periods of communitas and or contestation within the pilgrimage experience, they are neither certain nor constant, nor are they necessarily overt in nature. As is the case for locative forms of pilgrimage, it logically follows that the same may be found in non-locative practices. When placed into conversation, many of the elements proposed by the typologies of the Turners and of Eden Salno were present, either explicitly or implicitly, in Dicyon Pilger. When compared with the Turners, the three stages were largely visible. The Sion pilgrims spiritually leave Ulm to go to the Holy Lands and return 208 days later, thus fulfilling the larger pattern of leave-taking, journeying, and return. The leaving is marked with specific tasks which serve symbolically to separate them from their quotidian lives. The Sion pilgrims must ask for permission to engage in the journey, take the Lord's Supper, and prepare a will in case they should die. Performing these steps marks a breaking away from the quotidian and their everyday community. As such, even though they do not physically travel, and in many cases must continue to go about their daily responsibilities, the Sion pilgrims understand themselves as co-locatively being away. While on the journey itself, it is impossible to say if spontaneous communitas emerged due to a lack of any accounts from the Sion pilgrims themselves. What appears in Die Sion Pilger is rather what is termed by the Turners as normative communitas, as there is an attempt to reproduce or encourage fellow feeling. For example, prior to the departure of the Sion pilgrims, they are instructed to travel as a group and engage in daily readings together, thus giving them the opportunity to share the same experiences. Together, they face many trials and tribulations, as seen previously in the example of the treacherous night at sea. As they travel together day by day and have the same experiences along the journey, it is possible that episodes of communitas would emerge in a similar way to how it does in physical pilgrimage journeys. What is known about the Sion pilgrims is that they do encounter the divine throughout the journey. Most notably, Jesus' mother, the Virgin Mary. At many points along the journey, the Sion pilgrims are allowed to enter into dialogue with her. For example, on day 69, they beseech the Virgin Mary to, quote, help them understand hidden and divine secrets, end quote. To this she replies, quote, as God has chosen me to manifest his secrets through me, so God selects certain people to whom he reveals the secrets, especially those who imitate me as much as they are capable of, end quote. Through this statement, the Sion pilgrims are told to imitate the Virgin Mary in all things, but especially along their journey. She even identifies herself as a pilgrim, much like the sisters, in another such discourse on day 98. Quote, so be informed that from my early youth until the day of my death, I have been a pilgrim and have wandered from one place to another full of love. But I did this without digressing into the world and without losing my self-concentration, end quote. Not only do the Sion pilgrims encounter the divine, but they are told that the Virgin Mary is in fact one of their number. After returning to their quotidian lives, it is unclear if the Sion pilgrims understood themselves as having been transformed, again as no writing exists. It stands to reason, however, that they were probably understood as having benefited spiritually from their journey. As Fabry mentions many times in the text how the Sion pilgrims benefit greatly from seeing the Holy Lands in their idealized, Christianized state. He suggests that this also leads to greater spiritual merits through the indulgences granted through traveling in this way. Additionally, it was understood that the Sion pilgrims met and conversed with the Virgin Mary directly, and this is a divine meeting that a nightly pilgrim, quite frankly, could not be guaranteed. Turning to the typology of Eden Salno, contestation is also seen within the journey. Overt episodes of contestation are only seen through Fabry's description of real-life Jerusalem. For example, when he describes the hostile conditions the nightly pilgrims faced in Jerusalem. Although theoretically protected by their guides, it was fairly common for pilgrims of the time to be verbally abused, spat on, and the victim of gang thefts by the local population. These instances of violence are obviously not going to be experienced by the Sion pilgrims, leading to one of the benefits that Fabry mentioned so many times. Implicit contestation, however, is often experienced between the nightly and Sion pilgrims through the multiple meanings presented by Fabry of sacred centers. One such instance is when visiting the Hole of Purgatory, which is a stone for holy water built into the wall of St. Helena's Chapel in the Holy Sepulchre. The nightly pilgrims understand the site in a very rationalized way, while Fabry presents it to the Sion pilgrims quite differently. As described through Fabry's other works, Pilgerbuch and Evagatorium, he states how the nightly pilgrims are told that, quote, simple people say that you can hear cackling, end quote. On the contrary, the Sion pilgrims are told that, quote, "In the chapel where there is a stone for holy water built into the wall, and when someone puts his head in and he hears a great roaring and mournful rumbling, as if he could hear lamentation and wailing from the many wailing and shrieking people. It is said that the crying out and wailing is that of the wretched souls in purgatory, beseeching the pilgrim's help. Therefore, one should pray there for their souls with the psalm." End quote. This deviation between the nightly and Sion pilgrims do not actually represent a direct conflict, but rather reflect two separate journeys that are occurring within the same space. The meanings created are different because the nightly pilgrims have access to the physical space, while the Sion pilgrims see the spiritual reality. Hence, contestation or multiple meanings are clearly present. Although not initially discussed in the research of the Turners, nor in that of Eden Salno, non-locative pilgrimages may be discussed in terms of their typologies. Much as with locative journeys, not all characteristics of these typologies may be immediately evident, nor consistently present. They do, however, give a much-needed communicational tool to bring these journeys into conversation with the academic discourse on pilgrimage. Although the example I used of Dision Pilger is a historical one, the possibility of non-locative technology is a growing reality. It is now possible to visit the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela virtually online. With the recent consumer marketability of virtual reality apps and headsets, it's only a matter of time before pilgrimages are directly designed in this non-locative way. In fact, the large travel boards and the travel conferences for the last 3 years have been meeting specifically around the idea of what does virtual travel look like? What would a virtual travel package look like if someone were to go, say, on vacation to Italy without actually leaving Montreal? When this shift does occur towards non-locativity, it'll be helpful to have the means to discuss all the types of pilgrimage, both past and present. In this way, perhaps, Deborah Ross will finally be correct, and pilgrimage will become a universal phenomenon. So that concludes this part of the lecture. Now, hopefully, if technology is willing, I'll be able to post a link to a live session that we can actually sit down and talk, and I can answer some questions for you there. If not, I'm sure I'll be typing something frantically right now. So anyways, hopefully I'll see you guys over there.